In episode 12 of Mobycast, John discusses his key takeaways from Gluecon 2018. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about containerization, Docker, and modern software deployment. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Rich and Chris. It's number 12, Mobycast number 12. I'm excited to be here today. We like to get started every week with just a little recap on what we've been up to this week. So what have you been up to, Rich?
So we were launching a site this week, and sort of as a result, I didn't have a whole lot that I could jump into. So I started to sort of look through our static framework to see if I could build anything new. And I went down this rabbit hole of trying to build my own set of generators or scaffolding generators or whatever. I've always liked how Rails sort of just built stuff for you. And so what I'm trying to accomplish is just write some sort of CL command and have some things created and put into the right folders. So I'm about halfway through that and everything's broken. So hopefully next week I'll have a little bit of an update on it.
Nice. So you spent your week buried in tech.
Yeah.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, kind of the same deal after being on a plane for the past 5 weeks or so. This was kind of like the first week back in the office, tied to the keyboard, and kind of rolling up the sleeves and getting back into it. So did quite a bit of kind of AWS maintenance and updating to our clusters. Also building out a new environment for just purely for doing demos. A stable, basically production copy environment that we can do demos on. And then also doing quite a bit of just planning and strategy for the projects that I've been leading.
I know you're sandbagging because all of our AWS build-outs and deploys are totally automated. So if you spent the whole week doing that, it must meant you got a new game that you were playing or something.
No, it was that was one day of work too. Not quite one day of work, but that was actually I tore down all of our machines in one day and rebuilt them all and redid the way that we're doing our logging log collection to deal with some issues. So and updated it all to the latest greatest AMIs. So
yeah, that's actually good. That was obviously a poor attempt at a joke, but the dream would be if everything was automated, and that the reality is that this stuff does take some time. But I'm impressed how much you got done in a short time. It sounds like. And then as for me, I went to a conference this week, one called Gluecon. It's in Denver. It's been held for 10 years now. And it is about the glue, about APIs, about now containers, about, building distributed systems. They also started introducing the B word this year, but we won't talk about blockchain. So that was what Gluecon was about. And I thought that, this is the segue. This is what we'll talk about today. So today we'll talk about the state of the containerization world based on essentially the pulse that I took over the last 2 days at Gluecon. And the types of attendees at Gluecon are, it is a lot of Colorado companies. It's a lot of telecom companies, a lot of some healthcare companies, and then big companies like IBM are there, Microsoft is there, Oracle is there, and then, random other folks from software companies. It's a lot of developers and development managers, It's not really an executive-focused conference. The instructions that they give to speakers, and I was also lucky enough to be a speaker, is that your talk should have code in it. So every talk did have some code in it, whether it should have or not. So anyway, I wrote down about 5 takeaways that I thought we could try to discuss in just a short 20-minute podcast today. So the first one is Kubernetes. In the entire conference, there were something like 60% of the talks were specifically about Kubernetes-related things. And then the other 40% at least mentioned Kubernetes. This is not a surprise. Kubernetes is the main orchestrator, and it's what all big enterprise companies are focused on. But I was a little surprised that I didn't hear a bit more talk of ECS and very surprised that I did not hear the word swarm once. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, given that the conference that you were at, Gluecon, I'm not surprised at all that people weren't talking about ECS. Now, if you're at reInvent, a totally different story. And then as far as Swarm goes, pretty much I think the writing's on the wall there for Docker that's not going to survive. And they've kind of acknowledged that with kind of now having native support for Kubernetes being built into the engine. So I would definitely see Swarm kind of going off into the sunset, and Kubernetes and ECS are going to battle it out.
Right on. And I talked to Joe Beta from Heptio, and I talked about ECS and Kubernetes a little bit, and specifically also talked about EKS, which is in beta now, and hopefully will be GA soon. And Joe said that he does think that there's just going to be an onslaught of new Kubernetes usage as soon as EKS is available. And I sort of expect that Kelsus will be looking pretty hard at EKS. I don't know. What do you think? Are we going to look hard at that? EKS is Elastic Kubernetes Service, and that will be AWS's managed Kubernetes service, so that it helps you configure and run Kubernetes.
Gotcha.
And Chris, do you think that we're going to be taking a hard look at EKS?
I don't know if hard look, but definitely a tangential one. Don't really see. I see that as being really useful and interesting for people that have been using Kubernetes and also want kind of still want that flexibility to say, like, we have some stuff running on-prem, we have some stuff running in the cloud, we may even have multiple cloud providers, so they don't want to be locked in to the AWS orchestrator, ECS. But if you're in AWS, like, nothing is going to be tighter for running Dockers and containers than Amazon's version of its orchestrator. So, I don't see a compelling reason for us to say, oh, we're going to switch from ECS to EKS. I think it's more of a migration path to, like you said, there's so many people running Kubernetes right now inside Amazon, and they're managing those cluster hosts themselves, and it's not integrated in with load balancers and all the other goodness that you get with ECS. So that's where EKS comes in. It's for those folks that are using that. They can now use it and take advantage of some of that great AWS integration goodness.
Right on. And I agree with you. So it kind of leads into another sort of thing. You had mentioned that you're not surprised, given the audience at Gluecon, that it was all about Kubernetes. And it's true. When you have cable companies and telecom companies and other sort of big enterprise, sort of do it the old way kind of companies, and not cozied up to AWS types of companies, it's unsurprising to see Kubernetes. What was interesting, though, and this is the second takeaway, is that there were all of these talks, and a lot of their talks were not that technically complex. If you've been able to follow along with Mobycast, you would have been fine in a lot of these talks. But the rest of the audience was not ready for these talks. So there are a lot of attendees, I would say more than half of the attendees were just, they need to go through the process of Dockerizing their stuff and getting out of their legacy, treating servers as pets world. And so to sit there and listen to somebody talk about something called Istio, which is a service mesh tool set, they're like, service mesh? Oh my God. I just have this legacy monolith that's a collection of monoliths, and I don't even really understand what the value of a service mesh would be, let alone some of these detailed pieces of functionality that you're talking about that come with the service mesh. That's just, blown right by me. So I just say that because I think that a lot of the audience could benefit from ECS and does just need to get some services behind a load balancer running in Docker that can scale up and down. And that's what ECS is great at. But they're sitting here going to conferences that are all about Kubernetes, service meshes. And it's like, I think that there's something to that. I think that this conference and the sort of people that are at it are leading a charge, and whether or not the people that kind of need to be the next followers should be using ECS or Kubernetes, they're probably going to find themselves using Kubernetes just because that's the loudest sound in the room. You hear what I'm saying, Chris? Like, we're just all following each other, and if everybody's shouting about Kubernetes, it's hard to hear the ECS, the pure ring maybe off in the corner of ECS.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about this in a previous episode, how the pace of innovation is relentless. The just technology is changing constantly. Service messages, no one was talking about that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and now you have a whole bunch of products in that space for dealing with the control plane inside your across all your nodes and whatnot. You have things like service discoverability. There's a lot of pieces to this, and so you go to, especially these conferences that are geared more towards the open source world. It's not packaged up. There are a lot of knobs to be turned, and it can be very overwhelming and confusing. And I think a lot of people do go to that, and they're just like deer in the headlights, and don't know what to do with it other than like, wow, it sounds really cool, but not sure how practical it is for them. So, this is an ongoing problem of like, how do you keep up and transition, and how do you get it in bite-sized chunks that make sense for you to start using and adopting. And people just have to make it a priority, because it's really easy just to be like, to say it's too hard, throw your arms up and just kind of go back to business as usual.
Right. And that's a good, there was a talk from Brendan Burns, who was one of the people who originally created Kubernetes. And the talk was titled, "This is Too Hard." And so you just said those exact words, Chris. This is too hard. But one of the points that he made at the beginning of the talk was, you can't throw your hands up in the air. You can't walk away from this, because the expectation of everybody now is that you're going to be creating distributed systems that work, that are available. That's just, even if you're making a little mobile app, you're going to make some distributed systems behind that app that provide APIs that are always up and always available, and there's not going to be a downtime from midnight to 2 a.m. They're just available, and you do rolling updates, and you do things the modern way. That's everybody's expectations now. Users, CEOs, everybody. So that's really a problem, that it's too hard. It's a desperate problem. And I think that everybody's working really hard, including Kelsys, at solving this. We're trying to help with training. We're trying to help with talking about it on this podcast. And then tool builders are building tools to try to deal with this on the other side. Brendan said that he feels like they've done a good job of making it easier to run distributed systems with Kubernetes. And that the next step is to make it easier to build distributed systems. And I totally agree. I think a point that he made is that the minimum number of files and configurations that you need to build a distributed system is something like 9. And there's, that's too many. If you need to have 9 different files with configurations in them just to stand up a hello world service in Kubernetes, that's too much. That's too hard.
Hey, this is Rich. You might recognize me as the guy who introduces the show, but is pretty much silent during the meat of the podcast. The truth is, these topics are oftentimes incredibly complex, and I'm just too inexperienced to provide much value. What you might not know is that John and Chris created the training product to help developers of all skill sets get caught up to speed on AWS and Docker. If you're like me and feel underwater in these conversations, head on over to prodockertraining.com and get on the mailing list for the inaugural course. Okay, let's dive back in.
It'll be interesting to see where people tackle this problem.
I kind of want to challenge that real quick, if we can, that this
sure
is hard, because part of me thinks that it's too hard for people who don't have the education and the experience, and the result of the open source community has, people like myself have emerged, right? People who shouldn't be in this 20 years ago would never have the opportunity are now in it. So it's too hard for me. It's probably a lot too hard for a lot of people in that conference. But like you said, you sat through it and everything made sense. Chris would sit through it.
Right.
Makes sense. And so
Of
what I
course.
wonder is it too hard, or do we have too high of expectations as an end consumer of what we think is possible on a budget? And on the other end, are people just saying that they're more experienced than they really are, right? Are they getting involved without the experience, the education that they really need? And isn't that more of the problem, right? I never can call myself an engineer because I don't have a degree, but I can call myself anything else. And really, like no one's going to ever really argue with that. I could call myself a senior developer. I guess the only thing I can't call myself is an engineer because you need a degree for it. But I mean, it seems to me that it's only too hard because there are like access to it is easier, right? Like if you're using all of those servers just to throw up a hello world, well, you don't get the point because you don't need to do that.
No. So let me just address that a little bit. I think that things are cyclical, and that we're at a point in time right now where doing something that should be fairly straightforward is too hard. So if the idea is that you want to put up a service that can essentially like look up, what parts are available by part ID number, and in order to do that, you have to put, you have to do all this configuration and think about availability zones on AWS, and think about failover, think about all kinds of things that don't actually just get you that part ID or that part by the ID, then it is too hard. And it's kind of, if you look back and why is this cyclical? It's because, early on, in order to do the same thing, in the 80s, it was also too hard. You maybe had to do assembly language to create a lock so that your code could run without getting stepped on by other code. And like that was also very hard. And then later, higher order programming languages came along that made that type of stuff a lot easier. So as each thing becomes easier, then expectations go up, and then things get hard again. So in the mid 2000s, things got a little bit easy for a while. It was possible to create web applications without really knowing too much and just get them out there and running. And expectations were fairly low about their stability and scalability. But then those expectations went way up with the introduction of mobile, and just, relentless progress by companies like Netflix and Google and Twitter. So yeah, as we move to the cloud, expectations have gone up and things have become difficult. And so it's our job as developers to make them easy again. And then the next difficult thing will come along. I haven't given you a chance to speak to that, Chris. Do you disagree?
No, I mean, I think it's just the evolution of the ecosystem. So it wasn't expected back in the late 90s, early 2000s, because just the tools, the infrastructure, the ability to kind of be available to everyone wasn't there. But it is now, right? So it's now part of the expectation. Like you don't have to, like, having the fail well is just not acceptable. Having scheduled downtime, not so acceptable anymore, because all the infrastructure and the capabilities of the tools are there to do it, right? Anyone can do it now. It's in the hands of the many. It's no longer just in the hands of the big ones like AOL or Microsoft or Netscape. So, it's just everything is advancing, evolving. Technology is like, and again, it's not slowing down. Like we are staring in the face of like how AI and ML and blockchain and Moore's law and who knows, quantum computing, self-driving cars, drones, like it's not slowing down, people.
That's interesting. It actually makes me think that maybe there's this inflection point that we've hit where, like, as humans, we just can't keep up with it, right? It's like all those things that you just said are just mind-boggling individually. And then in aggregate, they're just not even something you can comprehend. So it's too hard, but I think it's because our expectations for what we can do are sort of outpacing our availability or our potential to do them.
Yeah, and this is probably this is like we could totally sidetrack on this and have a whole session on it. But like, this is where like augmentation comes in, right? So whether you call it personal assistants or it's robots or AI, it's like, again, it's like the expectation will be like people will be able to do this because you have these other things that help you deal with that, right? So it's no longer going to be just your own brain that has to deal with all this stuff to keep up with it. You're going to have help. You're you're going to have, you're going to have robots. You're going to have like really deep AI capabilities, and you're going to be able to, like, Alexa is still in its early stages, but what is it going to be 5 years from now? It's like, you can't even imagine what it's going to be.
Right. So we're coming up on the 20-minute mark here, and we've only hit on 2 of the 5 things that were takeaways from Gluecon. I just want to read off here what the other 3 are, because maybe we can fit in one more quick one for our listeners. So there's a lot of worry about cloud lock-in. There's a lot of people that are wanting to jump really straight into serverless, and there's a particular reason for that I wanted to talk about. And then the final thing is that I saw that there were fewer vendors this year, and that could be anything from, things happening within the Gluecon planning world to actual, reasons that some of the vendors I saw last year might not be there anymore, like maybe they didn't survive. So those are 3 more things I wanted to talk about. Maybe we could just quickly touch, because we've touched on this in a previous episode, I think we could quickly touch on people wanting to jump heavy and hard into serverless. So we've talked about how serverless has a right fit, right tool for the job type of fit. But what we're seeing is that people want to use it for everything. And I had a conversation with one of the founders of a company called Stackify that provides essentially, GitHub to deploy dashboarding and monitoring and sort of help for serverless applications. And when I talked to him about who was using serverless and what his target market was, he talked about how Lambda's biggest user base is not enterprises, not companies with sophisticated needs around event management and event-driven systems, but people that are just wanting to get something done quickly, and startups and people that don't want to think about infrastructure. And I thought that was interesting. So whether or not it's a good idea for people to be using Lambda for their whole application, that's what people are using it for. And it's seeing exponential growth in that area. And I find it fascinating. And I think it's something to be aware of when we think about the software market. Would you have guessed the same, Chris?
Yeah, not surprising. In a way, you can kind of think of it as like kind of what the basic programming language did for folks, right? It's kind of something that makes it really accessible. You can put together like these really quick things that do like prints hello world, or it does something like it resizes an image or whatever it is that you're doing in Lambda, or maybe you're doing a very easy Alexa skill or something. So doesn't surprise me at all. But like actually building like true engineering software, like that's a whole nother story. So that may be really good news for Stackify, but I think it's like what happens after that? Like how long do they stay with that, right? Like if it does grow from like being more than a prototype or a toy into something that really needs to be mature and that they depend on, then like is that the right thing?
Right. And what are those boundaries? Like for a microservice, say you put a microservice on Lambda, what kind of limitations does it have around monitoring? What kind of limitations does it have around scaling up quickly? And how big can it scale? And how much does that cost versus doing some of the hard work around creating a distributed service? So lots to talk about there, but questions as well, because if the reality is that all these companies are building up big systems on Lambda, and the reality is also that some of those companies are going to succeed, I guess I wonder how screwed are they going to be when they achieve that success? And is it going to kill them? Are they going to move to other systems, or are they going to be able to figure out a way forward with Lambda? It'll be interesting.
Indeed. Yeah. And for me, like a fundamental question for those folks is like, why are you so excited about serverless? Because motivations, I think, will kind of dictate whether they are successful in the future. If the motivations are kind of in line with what it gives you, then it makes sense. But otherwise, it's like if your motivation is like, well, it's too hard to figure out how to run servers or infrastructure, it's probably not the right reason. Right. There's other things that you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah. It doesn't prevent you from having to operate a running system.
Mm-hmm. At some point, we should do an episode just on serverless, so I can wrap my head around this a little bit more, because I'd like to know inherently what's wrong with what they're doing. Like why is it sort of a definite problem when they grow to certain sizes?
Yeah, maybe we could do that next week. I think that would be a good topic to just dive a little further into, because I think it's on everybody's mind. And I think there are definitely people out there that wonder, if I'm not using serverless, am I making a bad architectural decision? Isn't that the modern way? So let's talk about that some more, for sure. Maybe next week. Well, I want to make sure that we don't lose listeners by talking for an hour. So let's wrap it up. Thank you so much again this week for your time, Rich and Chris.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, guys.
Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with the show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/12. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.